valuable knowledge you have.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on when you started your day. I am Professor Lynn Wooten, one of the co-directors of the Center for Positive Organizational Scholarship, along with Professor Jane Dutton. And Professor Gretchen Spreitzer and I are the hosts for the Spring POS Links, and we're happy to have you here. This is the third in our series of POS Links for the spring semester. And we have the honor of having Professor Richard Bagozzi. And he said do not tell a lot about him because he wants all the time to share his knowledge, so I'll be very brief, Rick.
Okay.
Other than having also the honor of Rick serving on my dissertation committee, he's a world-renowned scholar. And when I went to Google Scholar and just put in his name for citations, I got over 12,000. So he's very well-renowned. He served on multiple business school faculties. He recently came back to Michigan for Rice. And he's in the marketing department, as you can see, and in the School of College of Pharmacists and Clinical, Social, and Administrative Sciences department there. And what he's going to share with us today is we're going to take a different journey for those of us interested in positive organizational scholarship. He's going to share it from the aspect of marketing and consumer behavior and sales. And he's going to share us 3 neurological studies about how positive behavior and positive emotion looks in the brain. Let's give Professor Bagozzi a hearty welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for coming. There are 3 studies I'm going to talk about, and the first one is already in press, and the second one is I actually just submitted, and the third one is about ready to be submitted. So with 3 studies in this time period, I have to go over it pretty quickly. I thought I would shoot for a more intuitive kind of presentation, a non-technical presentation, so that's what I'm hoping to do. And, well, let me get started. The first study, this is not the title of it, but because it's too long, but it deals with what is called theory of mind, and I'll define that later, but it's referring to something that we're all doing really spontaneously when we interact with each other. We're making inferences about what the beliefs or feelings or intentions of the other person are without necessarily thinking about it. So we're going to look at, our purpose in this study was to see if we could develop, develop a psychological scale, and it turned out to be a 13-item scale, for measuring theory of mind abilities in managers. And we say autistic-like behaviors, and I suppose with this positive organizational scholarship orientation, this may be a little bit, give a lot of dissonance to you. But it's really, there is a positive aspect of this. And also when I talk about Machiavellianism at the end, and I'll be talking about psychopathy or sociopathy as well, just very briefly at the end. So yesterday I actually found a quote. Well, let me define autism first. Even though we really didn't study autistic people per se, we took insights from things that about the autistic mind that apply to all of us. And autism is this developmental brain disorder, which is characterized by the impaired social interaction and communication. The people in neuroscience might say that it's a fundamental limitation, similar to if we had a handicap, lost an arm or something, that all we can do is compensate for it from other parts of the brain that haven't developed. And I'm most familiar with that literature, actually, and I've often thought in those terms, but having worked with an autistic person, I've changed my mind about it, and I see it in a more positive light. So this is the quote I found yesterday. Let's read it together. Autists are described by others and by themselves as aliens among humans. But there's an irony to this, for precisely the opposite is true. They are, and to understand them is to begin to understand what it means to be human. Think of it. A disability is usually defined in terms of what's missing. But autism is as much about what is abundant as what is missing. An overexpression of the very traits that make our species unique. The autistic out-human, as contrasting inhuman, the humans, and we can scarcely recognize the result. So there's something about all of us, and we have a tendency to categorize people as autistic or schizophrenic and normal, but there's an overlap there that we share together, all of us. And moreover, Paul Collins and his spouse have written separately books. They have an autistic son. They've written books on this, and they're emphasizing this aspect of it, that it's something that we share together, and that there's extraordinary kinds of accomplishments, too, that autistic persons can achieve. So I'm taking a more positive approach about autism, and I'm going to try to show how we can draw upon what we know about autism and come up with some positive things about managers' behaviors. I want to give you some intuition, though, now about autism, and these are other things I found yesterday. This is a painting by de la Tour, who was a French painter in the Baroque period. He lived in the Lorraine area of France, near the German border in the east of France. And I think it's called the Ace of Diamonds. And just take a look at it now before I say anything. And notice that it's an extraordinary painting. It's really telling a story, the best you can do in a still portrait here. But if you look at their eyes, and if you look at their gestures and their body posture, something is really going on here. And the fellow at the right, the young one, he's looking down pensively at his cards, so he's deciding maybe what to do. But the way he's dressed, and a lot of the Baroque paintings use these kind of costumes, he's obviously a wealthy person. And he has more money than the rest of the people do on the table, and jewelry and his garment says something about him. And then maybe the woman in the center, who maybe our eyes go to first, who's pointing really and linking herself with the fellow there. So maybe they're lovers. But also they're probably fleecing this young guy, and the fellow there with the cards, you can see behind his back, he's pulling at an ace of diamonds. And the person serving them, in a sense, knows what's going on. So there's really a story here going on. And if we talked about it enough, there are probably a lot of other things happening that take a little bit of concentration to figure out. This painting, and I had seen it referenced in a technical article by Uta Frith, who's one of the world's British leading researchers in autism. And it was mentioned that this painting was used in one of their studies. So I found it on the internet. And they showed this painting to a high-functioning autistic woman in her 20s, Asperger's disease. And she looked at it apparently for over an hour and a half or something like that, and wrote down an incredible amount of detail in terms of the colors and the costumes, kind of technical aspects of the painting. And then she was informed more or less what I just described to you about the story going on there. The story that is based on us making inferences about the gestures and the eye movements or the eye directions and gazes and so on. And so she looked at the researchers and said something like, you people read into things so much that's not there. You're crazy. And she's very, being a high-functioning autistic person, she still didn't really grasp or see what's going on interpersonally in terms of the communication. And the idea or alleged aspects of what's going on there are that in the 3 regions of the brain that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, when a person is first developing autism, these regions aren't developing properly or fully, and so that they're physically, in a sense, not able to process what for us maybe, if we're non-autistic, is natural and automatic. Any reactions or questions? Okay. It's another cartoon I found over the weekend. Okay, who can put a price on love? Jim, when we think about in our normal kind of learning and discussions, we think very abstractly. And so here with love, you know, there are many kinds of love, but we'll think about it as eros, or agape, or philia, or telema, or another one. There's a fifth one. So we can talk about these things in a very abstract kind of way. There's an anthropologist, I found this interview on the internet, who was asked about things like this. This is Temple Grandin. And so here's what she says. She says, because I have autism, I live by concrete rules instead of abstract beliefs. And because I have autism, I think in pictures and sounds. I don't have the ability to process abstract thought the way that you do. Here's how my brain works. It's like the search engine Google for images. If you say the word love to me, I'll surf the internet inside my brain. Then a series of images pops into my head. What I'll see, for example, is a picture of a mother and horse with her foal. Or I think of Herbie the Love Bug, which was an old Volkswagen movie that was made, I think, in the late 50s or 60s. Or scenes from the movie Love Story, or the Beatles song, Love, Love, All You Need Is Love. So a person with autism looks at things quite differently. And but again, we might think of it as a spectrum or a continuum, abstract, literal, figurative. Okay. This was that Collins again, the father of an autistic son. He said, there's actually a tremendous fascination with Thomas the Tank Engine among a lot of autistic kids. I'd never heard of this till yesterday, and this morning my secretary and I went on the web, and I'll show you some pictures of this. Well, let's take a look now. Here's Thomas the Tank Engine. And they tell stories with this, and so the fellow on the left is happy, obviously. The one to his left, our right, is angry, and the one at the bottom, I would call that surprise. But if you look at all of those, I looked for sadness, and I couldn't find it on the net. But look at all of them. Nothing, the cheekbones, that part of the face doesn't change. The nose is basically the same. The only thing that's changing are the eyebrows, the openness of the eyes, and the mouth, which are three amongst other aspects of our face that convey what emotions that we're feeling. So let's go back and see what he says about this. The trains have faces on them, but they're not terribly expressive. Actually, I think they are expressive. I think he probably should have said they're not very detailed, you know, that they're simple. And they don't have hundreds of facial muscles the way humans do. Well, I don't think we have hundreds of facial muscles, but we have many of them. And they all are activated when we feel or a particular emotion. And earlier work that was done where they put transducers all over the face, where they're picking up the muscle movements, even when we're not actually moving our face, when we're feeling an emotion, those transducers will become activated, and according to corresponding patterns of movement, contractions, and releasing of the muscles. And so he's saying for an autistic child, it's much easier to interpret the train than it is to interpret people. But many autistic children like this cartoon. There's a movie, there are books, there are games that are played with this Thomas the Tank Engine. And it's a little easier for some autistic children to process those and to know what those emotions are, because they focus on it for a little bit longer time period. They're simple expressions, and they often interpret what the tank is, the emotion the tank is experiencing. He's feeling sad, for example, they'll say. Okay, and this is the mother of the same autistic child speaking. I remember someday commenting one time that there are a lot of autistic children who were big fans of Japanese animation or anime. And one of the reasons they thought was because of in these animations, the expression of emotion are so strong and clear-cut, you know. There's not a lot of nuance. They're either furious or afraid, and there's not a lot of in-between. So autistic kids can watch it fairly comfortably knowing what's going on. There's nothing subtle to pick up. Okay, well, one of our goals in this first study was to develop a scale for measuring interpersonal mentalizing of managers, and we applied it to salespeople. So here's the definition of interpersonal mentalizing, a little expanded version. It's the activity of inferring another person's beliefs or thoughts, desires, emotions, their risk preferences maybe, the decisions that they might be making or have made, their intentions, other mental states and events, and then adjusting their volitions, their decisions or intentions accordingly. That's our definition of interpersonal mentalizing. It's also related to putting oneself in the shoes of another person and mentally simulating, perhaps, what that other person thinks, wants, and intends. This is part of the classic definition of empathy, and there's reason to believe that interpersonal mentalizing goes along with that. We, in our first study, which has been in press now for a year, or forthcoming for a year, we were aware of this, but we, at that time, we didn't really know the literature well on what are called mirror neurons, which has shown more about this, the activation of empathic-like responses in the same region that we actually were measuring here, but didn't realize at the time, that I'll talk about in a sec. Now, I put this on just to talk about how regions of the brain have been associated with different mental processing. And so what we're looking at here is the left side of the brain. Here's the brain stem. And the frontal lobe, and I think it's hard to read in the back, so I'm going to read that, talks about, or is believed to be the site of our executive functioning, which are top-down thinking cognitive processes, controlling-like processes, planning, reasoning, impulse control. And some belief is that the dorsolateral region of the prefrontal areas is related to thinking ahead and inhibition of impulsive responses. And the ventral medial region here is connected to emotions and also some forward-looking planning-like activities. If you heard about or read Descartes' Error, he talks about a fellow who had an industrial accident in the 1800s. He was working, I think, in Vermont or New Hampshire, and he was a supervisor or a manager in the quarries. And one of the things they did in the quarries, they would drill holes and put in, they'd have a metal tube in there, not a tube, a solid rod. And the manager was looking under it because there's a dynamite under it. And when he was looking at it, it actually went off. And it went through the bottom of his chin, up through his skull, through the ventral medial area, and then shot out, or they pulled it out, I've forgotten now. He recovered physically and seemed to be normal at that time. But actually, because this area of the brain was damaged, it really affected his personality, and he lived a miserable life the rest of his life. But it was one of the early discoveries that different parts of the brain control different aspects of our behavior, or so that it is believed. I say that with the caveat because I've been reading there's a big controversy. Most of the people who work in neuroscience see the processes as located in our brain. And other philosophers, and I just finished Alvin Noy's book. He's a philosopher at Berkeley. The book just came out. And he says that consciousness, for example, isn't in our brain the same way that digestion is in our stomach. That consciousness is something that we do, so that's things out of us, outside of us. And he's part of, loosely speaking, he's part of that movement of embodied cognition and feelings, things that are more part of the qualitative and the hermeneutic, existential schools of thought, which are not as reductionist as the neuroscientists are. So I'm reading all that, and I guess I'm feeling a little bit torn or guilty in just presenting one point of view here. I want to acknowledge that there are different ways of looking at even some things such as consciousness, which is allegedly occurs inside the brain. Okay. These are the criteria that are used in the clinical sense for diagnosing autism. And this is from Uta Frist's book. And you can see they're very general. You know, impairment of reciprocal social interaction, like having poor eye contact. These are things that a clinician would apply to a young child. Or impaired communication, restricted repertoire of activities and behaviors, and repetitive phenomenon. They're rather loose, but this is the clinical area. And then on the other side of it, the more neuroscience has identified these regions of the brain. And again, we're looking at, this is a section, but this is from the left. And so one of the key areas is this medial prefrontal cortex region here. And I'll show pictures of that, of some of the managers that we looked at. And the temporal poles, left and right, and this temporal parietal junction region here, left and right. So there really are 5 areas at least that have been identified with autism that reflect this developmental disorder. And those are those 5 areas that we focused on. Okay, now what we did is we looked at the neuroscience literature, the communication literature, and the Salesforce manager literatures, and tried to identify what would be concepts or attributes of a person having this kind of impairment in communication and these autistic-like reactions. And we came up with 4 factors. And I'm going to just briefly talk about them to give you an intuition for them. The first factor was building rapport. So this is loosely defined as the ability to take an initiative in sales conversations and build rapport in conversations with others. And there were 3 items measuring that. And then the second factor was this detecting nonverbal cues, you know, the ability to notice subtle cues during sales conversations, or hints that a person might make, or what they might have even non-consciously have intended but were hinting at because of associations that went on in their mind. So we thought that this is another factor that's important, because our goal is to come up with a scale, a questionnaire that we can give to managers. Then the third factor we called taking a bird's eye view. Part of that is this ability to supply missing information when one is interacting with others in terms of what is being said or not said during the conversation. So it's almost stepping out of it and looking at what's going on between yourself and another person that you're interacting with. And then the last factor that we identified we called shaping the interaction, to influence the course of the transaction or the communication going on between yourself and another person. So we had 13 items that we ended up with. This first article actually had 4 studies in it. I'm going to focus on the 4th study. That's the theme that goes across all these papers, and that's the one that looks at the so-called processes in the brain. But there were 3 studies that led up to this that had to do with the what are called the psychometric properties of these measures. I'm not going to talk about those because it's hard to talk about it without getting into too much technical detail, and it'll take me away from, I think, the more intuition of what's going on. So I'm going to focus on the brain processes. Now, what's done in this kind of research is, and this is how we use the scale, you divide people into 2 different groups. So we developed a scale. We gave 13 items. We gave the scale to 130-some managers. And then we took the top 10 scorers and the bottom 10 scorers on this scale. So these are measuring autistic-like responses as a matter of degree. So the top 10 have the least autistic-like responses, and the bottom 10 maybe have the most. But they're presumably all average people. They're all Dutch salespeople. So that's for the 2 columns there. The high score, the STOM stands for Sales Theory of Mind scale. And this was just to see some of the differences between these two groups. Very small samples, so it's really not easy to find differences. They didn't differ in age and experience in sales, and neither did larger samples. So we wanted to do that to show that this is not just something connected with experience and learning, that it's something maybe having to do with fundamental traits or characteristics of the person. And then the STOM 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the averages of the items, 3 or 4 items in each case. And the numbers in here present the means, the ones not in parentheses. And whether the means are different or not is this T statistic on the right. A number 2 or greater means that those means differ. So for example, with the STOM 1, which was the building rapport scale, the average for these top 10 scores was 6.3, and the average for the bottom 10 was 5.3. And that difference is statistically different, so that the 6.4 is 3 is greater than the 5.3. And that's sort of just like a manipulation check. Interestingly, this row called adaptive selling shows that the high scores on this interpersonal mentalizing scale, those people score higher on adaptive selling than those scoring low on that scale. Adaptive selling is its own scale. It's the most widely used scale in our field. And it measures how well a person adapts in an ongoing interaction on the fly, so to speak, to the needs and changes of the contingencies going on in that interaction. Do they change what they say and how they say it? Do they listen well to the other person and adapt their behavior accordingly? Yes? Well, this is typically what's done, and it's because we're testing people one at a time in a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, and I forgot what it costs, but it's more than $500 per person just for using the machine, and it takes a while to do that. But it's also the size of a sample that's high enough. In our other studies, we have a little bit more. I think we have 12 or 14 in each group. But it's typically enough to find differences. So it's a kind of a cost thing, but also it's customary, and this is sort of the state of the art. So they score higher. This interpersonal mentalizing people score higher on adaptive selling than those scoring lower on interpersonal mentalizing. Social anxiety. Actually, people who score lower on this interpersonal mentalizing scale actually experience more interpersonal-like anxiety. On the weekend, when I was reading these things on autism, they talked about this couple that I mentioned with the autistic son spoke about going to Microsoft. And Microsoft was allegedly in one of their departments where they have their mathematicians and computer people. There's a rumor that many of the people there are autistic, and which some research shows that greater skills in mathematics or logic and sometimes is associated with autism. So they're presenting to these engineers and scientists there at Microsoft, and the presenter is noticing that they're all staring at their laptops. Now, those of you that have taught before have seen this with MBA students, and every time I see it, I'm wondering, what are they looking at? Are they reading the news, or are they writing down what I'm saying, or who knows what's going on? But so they were doing that with the speaker, and the speaker learned later, because they actually asked intelligent questions that showed they were listening a while. And he asked some of the people why they were doing that. And they said, because it turns out they were actually watching him on a webcam. So they are seeing him, and he was 15 feet away. But they felt more comfortable looking at a picture of him than they did looking at him full face, where all the movements of the face and gestures, which are really complex to process, that we've kind of learned. Partly it's probably hardwired and genetic, but also must be some learning that goes on there that's natural for us. But for them, it made them anxious. And when they interact with other people, often autistic persons, there is a higher feeling of anxiety, or can be. So at least that also was borne out here. And then the last scale there was from, I think this was from Hoffman's empathy scale, that measures perspective taking. How well can you take the perspective of another person? Can you put yourself in the shoes of another person when you're interacting with them and understand? This is a more cognitive dimension of empathy. And sure enough, the people scoring high in the sales theory of mind did statistically score higher on the perspective taking. But this is all kind of preliminary. And I found a couple pictures in a neuroscience book just to quickly show that there's a lot of technical aspects of it. Unfortunately, we had two technicians and MDs helping us. But you lay down on this table and you go inside this fMRI machine, which is picking up the flow of our blood and the oxygen. There's iron and there's a magnetic fields, and we can pick up these the amount of activation that's reflected is proportional to the flow. And there are all these amplifiers and preamplifiers and storage servers. I mean, it's a real complex process, kind of a mess. And a lot of processing goes on, or pre-processing of the image, and a lot of statistical and other kinds of normalization-like processes are applied. So I'm just mentioning that. I don't know much about it, other than just to put the pictures up here. I'm learning, though. Okay, so the brain in action. How do functional imaging studies identify which pattern of brain activity is associated with particular cognitive processes or affective processes sometimes? It's done by comparing activity during the performance of two tasks, which are identical in every way except for one, the presence of the cognitive processes of interest in the experimental group, and then the absence in the comparison task group. So we did that. Now, here again, the goal is to see differences in theory of mind, differences in being able to, speaking loosely, infer the thoughts, feelings, intentions maybe of persons that we're interacting with, or watching, as we did in the painting, as we looked at those people interacting. So what we did was, we had three kinds of experimental tasks that everybody went through. So there were 5 stories or scenarios that involved mental state attributions that were our theory of mind, our interpersonal mentalizing conditions. So everybody read 5 stories. It took about 30 to 33 or 6 seconds to read these stories. So there are 5 stories that involve a salesperson. I'll give you an example in a minute. A salesperson interacting with someone else. You read the story, and if you're really comprehending what's going on, you're processing at this interpersonal level of inferring the attributes of what's going on in the story itself between the persons, as if you were that person. And then there were 5 stories that everyone read, which we called the process condition. And this is typical with the work that's been done with autism. In the process condition, there's something going on there, but there's no opportunity or need for inferring the thoughts, feelings, beliefs, intentions of the other person. It's a control condition. And then the unlinked sentence condition, they read 5 kind of stories, same length and everything, where each sentence wasn't related to the next sentence. So let's take a look at some of them so you get a feeling for what I'm talking about. Here's the second scenario with the interpersonal mentalizing condition. So before these were done in Dutch, so this is not the best kind of English translation of it, so they might feel a little awkward. But before visiting a customer, Jacqueline always browses the customer's website. While browsing one of these websites, she noticed that the director, whom she has known for a long time, still works for the firm in question. But she also notices that many new people have joined the firm. Jacqueline is especially curious about what these new people think of her firm. However, Jacqueline first decides to speak with the director, the person she has known a long time. A little repetitive here. Therefore, she calls him to suggest having dinner together. And then a second later, or something like that, I forgot the timing, the question is asked, why did Jacqueline ask the director to have dinner with her? So they're actually, none of us had any experience nor any training in neuroscience at all. So when we first did this study, we had them read these stories. And then we discovered there was too much movement. So we had to do them all over again, and they were listening to them. So they listened to these stories, and while they were listening to it, they were inside that fMRI. So we were monitoring what's going on. I should mention that this was just this was a big gamble. This is one of those high risk, maybe high payoff kinds of studies. The studies that we're aware of that have been done, we're always comparing an autistic person to a normal person, or in some cases a mentally retarded person. It's much easier getting differences between those groups. We're dealing with differences in normal managers that we just divided them into high and low. So we had no idea if we're going to find anything at all. So it was we were taking a big risk here. So this was the interpersonal mentalizing conditions. They heard 5 of these scenarios. We had a particular kind of counterbalancing going on in our design. Here's an example of the process condition. In a steel company, the buying process occurs, and remember, these are all sales managers, so these kind of stories are natural to them, I guess. Occurs via a well-defined method. The buyers first study how previous firms supplied goods in collaboration with the technical staff. They make up a request for a proposal. This RFP is then sent by email to salespersons from different firms, who then indicate by email whether they can match the RFP. Subsequently, using economical arguments, the buyers determine which salesperson will deliver the goods. And then they're asked the question, on what basis do buyers make decisions about which salespersons will deliver goods? And then finally, they all read or heard 5 unlinked sentence conditions, which are a little bit funny, but I'll read it. People are working hard on the new block, and they expect it to be ready at the end of the next year. People are starting to ask when they will come with a new folder. One can ask if our vision about the future will catch on in the marketplace. The number of customers is rising according to a pattern. The housing market at this time is a bit unstable because the future of the tax deduction for rent is unclear. Around the Christmas season, the days are always short. It's kind of, there's no story going on there. There's no interpersonal mentalizing. Why is the housing market unstable? Okay. This is a summary of some of the findings with regard to the areas of the brain. I'm just going to show pictures, though, of this. And remember, these aren't pictures of one person. This is kind of a normalization or synthesis of all of the people and the conditions. So this is comparing the interpersonal mentalizing to the process task condition. And here we see, remember, the medial prefrontal cortex was one region that's has been correlated with autistic or high versus low mentalizing in our sense here. And so this is from the right side and the top, and I guess the back, or it could be the front. No, it must be the back. And that region is activated while they're listening to those stories for those people who are high versus low in the theory of mind. Because remember, we had 10 in each condition. And then this is the interpersonal mentalizing still compared to the process conditions. And this was the medial prefrontal cortex again, left and right, which differed. And this is the right temporal parietal junction. And this is the comparison of the interpersonal mentalizing minus the unlinked sentence condition, and for the medial prefrontal cortex and the right temporal parietal junction. So we're finding these differences, even though there are only 10 people in each group.
I didn't know what I was to be looking for in the pictures.
Well, yeah, these are the regions of interest here that are looked at, and they're, if there's a difference between those people who scored high on the interpersonal mentalizing from low, comparing these two conditions, listening to the interpersonal mentalizing versus either the unlinked sentence or the task one, it shows up to be statistically different, to be more activated at a higher level. So it's really picking up, in a sense, greater blood flow to that region. So the person who is scored high in interpersonal mentalizing, according to our paper and pencil test, that region of the brain is activated at a higher level. Yeah, where the crosshairs. Yes. It's a small area here. Now, this isn't, we played around with a lot of different kinds of pictures, and this isn't in our technical appendix, not in the article, but you can see where the regions are. And I'm colorblind, so I don't see these colors well. I'm red-green colorblind, but I think this is either red or yellow, I think. What color is it? It's red, okay. So it's another way of looking at it. This is it lights up, meaning that the group that's high in interpersonal mentalizing is activated stronger in that same region than the other group of people. But we also looked at the correlations between the scores on the overall scale, and in this case, this is the left temporal parietal junction, and it was, I think that's an 8-1. But it is positively correlated. There are 3 forthcoming articles out now in the literature. There's a big debate going on, and that I've read about the validity of these kind of correlations. But I'm not going to get into that now. And here's now looking at the same regions in the correlations. Again, they were significant. Okay. Now I mentioned that that brain stuff was study 4 in this first article, and studies 1, 2, and 3 were traditional kinds of psychometric tests that looked at what's called construct validity: convergent validity, discriminant validity, concurrent validity, predictive validity, and nomological validity. There are 4 kinds of things that are applied as measures of validity in the statistical psychometric literature. I'm not going to go through those, but I just wanted to mention in one of the studies where we're looking at this so-called nomological validity, this Sales Theory of Mind scale, there are really 2 distinct groupings of it. One is this rapport building, and the other is this detecting nonverbal cues, taking a bird's eye view and shaping the interaction. These are more instrumental, and these are more intangible, affective. The important thing for our purposes in the study was that we had measures of actual performance of these managers. And the traditional, the dominant received view, the traditional scale that's used in the literature is this Salesforce adaptiveness scale. And our claim is that that's an indirect measure of ability, and that it's based on, more fundamentally, these theory of mind processes. And in fact, that seems to be the case. And then moreover, when we look, the things that are not in parentheses were one sample, and those in parentheses another sample. So we had a kind of 2 replications. But the other point is that adaptiveness, which is often related to performance, once we control for and look at these more, we allege, more fundamental processes, then that actually goes by the wayside. And then there's a direct effect of these instrumental kinds of interpersonal mentalizing processes, and an indirect effect of rapport building through social anxiety on performance, such that the stronger the skill of interpersonal mentalizing, the less the felt anxiety and the higher the performance. So the direct and indirect effects there. Okay, so I'm going to skip over these statistical things here and go to the second study. The second study, actually we submitted it already, and it's for the purpose of the talk, I'm calling this Mirror Neurons and Customer Orientation by Managers, but the wordy title is in the bottom. Okay, now there are at least two fundamental ways of looking at interactions in a selling setting. The first one we call the sales orientation, which is consistent with maybe Williamson's transaction cost theory or traditional views of business, right-wing capitalistic views of that the buyer should beware, and the seller tries to convince the buyer to buy his or her product or service. So speaking figuratively, I just used this sentence, how can I convince this customer to buy our product? That's indicative of the so-called sales orientation. The customer orientation, on the other hand, follows the so-called marketing concept. Figuratively speaking, it asks, what is in the best interest of the customer? What's the customer needs? And how can I best respond to those interests? How can I adjust what I have to offer or what our company has to offer in terms of service or products to meet those needs? So it really, in a sense, almost starts with the needs of the customer. The other one starts from the needs that I have something to sell and I want to get rid of it. This is oversimplified, but they're sort of two extremes. And we wanted to study this customer orientation particularly. Well, we did study sales orientation as well. So there was a scale developed by Sachs and Weitz. It's a famous scale called the Sales Orientation Customer Orientation Scale. It's a 24-item scale, 12 measures that measure customer orientation and 12 that measure sales orientation. We could only use 10 total, so we took 5 from each of them. Time is really going here, so I'm not going to analyze the items, but I want to say that the sales orientation scale is not a very good scale, in part because many of the items are double-barreled. They say things like, I try to sell a customer all I can convince him to buy, even if I think it is more than a wise customer would buy. So they mix the customer and sales orientation together in some of the items, and some they don't. But this captures the flavor of it, I think. It's necessary to stretch the truth in describing a product to a customer. So they're asked to what extent does that describe them personally. Not at all, a little bit, moderately, a lot, extremely, or how much they agree or disagree with it. Okay. Now, one of the things that we want to look at here are empathy, empathic processes. Eisenberg is a psychologist, and this is in the Annual Review of Psychology, and so I'm using her definition. She defines empathy as an affective response, an emotional response that arises from the apprehension or comprehension of another person's emotional state. In the psychology literature, classically, there were 3 components of empathy. One of them is this I called perspective taking before, so putting yourself in the shoes of another person. It's a more thinking-based kind of aspect of empathy. The second is a feeling-based. It's also called empathic concern. To what extent do you actually feel what another person feels that you're interacting with at the time? A third component was called protection motivation. When someone is in a difficult situation, is threatened in some way, how strongly do you feel you want to protect them and help them? And the fourth component was called fantasy elaboration, which involves thoughts and feelings and association a person makes when they're feeling empathic. Now, that's the classic literature on empathy that's based on questionnaires. Desetti and Lamb and others have looked at empathy in terms of identifying processes in our brains, so to speak. So one of them is this cognitive capacity to take the perspective of the other. And that especially resides in what's called the precuneus region of the brain. It's in the back here, like this, forward of the occipital region. It could be also in the temporal parietal junction area, I believe. But taking the perspective of the other is really a top-down-like process, an executive-like process. So it's a more, so to speak, thoughtful, not as automatic-like as the other emotional reactions, which is the second one here. Sharing the feelings of the others, called empathic concern, which occurs through these mirror neurons, especially in this premotor frontal cortex area, the pars opercularis region, and is believed to go through the insula to the amygdala. That's one root of the feelings. And then there's this monitoring mechanism that registers the source of the experienced affect in ways that we differentiate ourselves from others. As if we weren't to differentiate ourselves so much from others when we're, say, watching someone in a real vulnerable situation, then instead of experiencing empathic concern for the other per se, we might be experiencing, which is the other person, we might be experiencing our own distress, empathic distress. So there's this kind of balancing, like, speaking loosely, processes that are going on, which is also believed to occur in the precuneus regions. So those are the three of the regions that we are looking at. And I want to mention that this was discovered by accident. So, well, you know, it was Rizzolatti was a leader of a laboratory in Parma, Italy. And one of his fellow researchers, Gallese, they're studying these monkeys, macaque monkeys. Rhesus monkeys are real temperamental and are hard to handle, but these are a little more docile. And they were actually putting electrodes at the neuron level in the brain, which is hard to do with people. That's why we're looking with the functional magnetic resonance from the outside. But I was reading a little while ago, Jacoboni with a colleague at UCLA studying schizophrenia, I think it was. They were actually able to do a similar-like thing with the electrodes right at the neural level. They had the monkeys hooked up with these neurons, and I think that they were also hooked up to an auditory thing, so that this was in the premotor frontal cortex area, and maybe other areas too, but in that area for sure. And when the monkey was sitting on a table or ledge, and Gallese was somewhere nearby there doing some things, and he heard this noise, which was the activation in the monkey's brain of this premotor frontal cortex, such that when he, the researcher, was making movements, the same regions in the monkey's brain were activated. I hope I have that right. It's been a while since I read that. And the idea is that these mirror neurons in our mind resonate or harmonize, coordinate with others. So the same parts of our brain that get activated when we're moving physically actually get activated when we see another person moving. And if we're told to imitate another person moving, I think it's even a stronger activation of those same regions. So this is very important, especially for empathy. So when we're seeing and experiencing another person in distress or pain or maybe positive emotions possibly, those same things are being fired in us automatically. And that was discovered by the Rizzolatti's group. And here's a picture of those regions of the brain that are being activated. ventral premotor cortex is the one I mentioned there. It's in the front part to the right of the center. We're looking at the right side of the brain here. And what I was calling the temporal parietal junction, or this posterior sulcus, forgot now. Superior temporal sulcus, thank you. One of the things I've been discovering is that researchers are using different terms for, I think Broca's region is another one that's used in the front, and I've gotten mixed up a lot, but I'm figuring it out. So we made a lot of hypotheses here with regard to what's going on, and basically it's what I mentioned without reading all these. The first thing we looked at was theory of mind with these salespeople that we looked at here. But then we looked at the perspective taking and this differentiation of self-other in the precuneus region, and then the affective aspect of the empathic processes we were looking at in this medial prefrontal cortex, this pars operculoris, insula, amygdala. And I'm not going to be able to get into it here, but if you look at the verbal literature in psychology with regard to Machiavellianism, which is related to empathy, there are a lot of conflicting findings. And our hypothesis here is that those people who were more customer-orientated would score higher on the empathic responses, both in this automatic sense, this is bottom-up sense through the prefrontal cortex, motor prefrontal cortex, and this more top-down in the precuneus regions. And I'm going to, I'm going to talk real quickly about the experimental design. This is very similar to research done in this area, and we followed, I forgot the guy's name now, researchers in Holland. But everyone viewed 5 male and 5 female video clips of men and women showing either happy face, surprise, anger, disgust, or neutral faces. And then there were these moving geometrical objects that they watched, part of the control. And then this was the summary of the differences, and some of them. I think I have some pictures of them. Let's do it this way. So the same kind of things are lighting up here, showing the differences between those that score high on customer orientation versus low on customer orientation. So the high customer orientation people are more empathetic than those scoring low. Okay, so I'm going to go to the study 2 for this second paper. So we said, now let's look at salespeople in the field and see whether high customer orientation is related to what we call alliance building, where that's in turn having these 3 components, where they discern the capabilities and practices in the buying center social network. And the kind of products and services these people sell, there isn't just one buyer, but there's a network of buyers. And the better that they're able to know the abilities of the people they're dealing with and their contingencies and so on, the better that we felt that people high in customer orientation would be building these alliances. And then more directly, in a functional sense, they're acquiring knowledge from customers. And then they're also gaining knowledge of the context being the industry, the economy, other kinds of things in the situation and circumstances going on there, that they glean from reading the press reports, by going to conferences and shows for the product and so on. Okay, so what we found here was that, looking in the middle there, that the correlation of this customer orientation with those 3 regions were respectively 5, 6, 6, 6, and 4, 4. So there's a moderately to a high correlation between customer orientation and each of those alliance building functions. And then compared to the people who are stronger in sales orientation, you can see that those correlations for each of those three areas are correspondingly lower. Okay, now the last study, and I'll go through it real quick, because it uses the same methodologies I've talked about already. So, you know, is there something Machiavellian about managers that we should be aware of? Also, we use this as a way of looking at empathy. There was some research that showed that Machiavellians actually score lower in empathy, but it's all based on paper and pencil studies. And we thought that this might be a way of getting, if we looked at people scoring high versus low in Machiavellianism, we might get some insight into the empathic-like responses going on in their minds. So, you know, marketers deal with things like advertising, which are kind of arm length kind of interpersonal influence, and then one step closer, which is like watching a movie, but a step closer to that, which is like being at a play, as maybe this scene shows, where she is entertaining these two fellas, and they're both understand the relationship, and it's sort of a game. There really isn't any nefarious kinds of things going on there in terms of deception and the like that a Machiavellian might do. And likewise, this is again from the Baroque period, and this is one of Caravaggio's paintings, Fortune Teller. And notice, look how strongly their eyes are linked. They're not even looking at the hands, but we, of course, are or can. But they're in concert with each other. You know, he wants to be told his fortune, this young dandy here, and she's obliging for presumably a small amount of money. And here's, I forgot who, I lost my notes on these over the last few days. I forgot who did this one. But it's the same period, I think. And so she's a prostitute. And the one guy on the left is maybe talking about how much it's going to cost, and the other fellow is holding a coin. But they're, you know, she's enjoying herself and is into this interaction, like a buyer-seller maybe. And there's nothing really strongly, overtly manipulative here. And then just to find another one, this was the only, from the Baroque period, it's a Dutch painter. It's the only one I could find done by a woman, and it's called The Seamstress. And so she's a seamstress in that man's house, allegedly, and he's trying to seduce her, but she's resisting. So now we're getting to a little bit of manipulative intent. And this one even shows it more dramatically. Same time period, and he's having his fortune read by what at that time was called a gypsy. In this era, gypsies had come from Egypt. And so she's wearing, the woman on our right, is wearing a traditional Egyptian gown. If you looked at it closely in the bottom right, the embroidery on there is a classic kind of scene. It shows two falcons or eagle-like birds ready to prey on. It's symbolic of what's happening. They're preying on him. So the woman at his right, our left, is taking something from his pocket. The other woman in the center is actually cutting the tassels, those gold tassels off. So here's a more manipulative thing that maybe corresponds to Machiavellianism. And here is our friend Machiavellian. So he lived in this time period. And here are some quotes that I found. A prince never lacks legitimate reasons to break his promise. It is necessary for him who lays out a state and arranges law for it to presuppose that all men are evil, and they are always going to act according to the wickedness of their spirits whenever they have free scope. Men are so simple and so much inclined to obey immediate needs that a deceiver will never lack victims for his deceptions. And here's some more, but they're all of the same flavor. By extreme subtlety, it should be, even to the point of formlessness, be extremely mysterious even to the point of soundlessness. Thereby you can be the director of the opponent's fate. So I went through the literature on Machiavellianism. it's a personality style that's characterized by this conduct and taking advantage of other people for one's own personal gain. And it's often contrasted, obviously, with benevolence or maybe even cooperative actions. Plays a central role in politics, business, legal matters, everyday behavior, presumably. Going through the literature, I identified the following characteristics. In no one place were all of these mentioned, but this is kind of my synthesis. So they tend to have a worldview in Machiavellians, that a dismal outlook on life, and also the nature of people that are dealing with. They often have been said to have this tendency to feeling that they should strike first because the person you're interacting with will screw you if they can. This is kind of how it's put. So they distrust people and are cynical. Their orientation is one of opportunism. Here's the strike first principle. Their tactics, they use deceit and guile to a large extent, flattery, manipulation. And they tend to be amoral, or at least immoral, and they don't, compared to an average person, they don't feel guilt, shame, or embarrassment much. It just doesn't happen to them. And they exhibit this so-called cool syndrome. They're not distressed by others' suffering, for example. And they're not committed to individuals, groups, or ideals very much. Okay, so with that as a background, we gave the Mach 4 scale to 100 and some salespeople again, divided into high and low groups, scoring on Machiavellianism, and tried to answer all this contradictory research that's cropped up, where some people, I had a whole list of it here, but I'm not going to be able to go through it, but some people feel that Machiavellians actually should empathize more with others. It helps them to take advantage of them. On the other hand, some studies where they measured Machiavellian empathy and Machiavellianism found that there's a negative correlation, and that there's a positive correlation with psychopathy. Some people feel that the most effective Machiavellianist peoples are, they're on one hand attuned to the needs of others, but on the other hand are always trying to be deceptive, so that both positive and negative things go on at once. Let me just summarize it here. We hypothesized that and found that Machiavellians were poorer on theory of mind skills than non-Machiavellians. That is, they weren't as well able to infer the needs, feelings, beliefs of other people as well as the average person. We're not able to. We also hypothesized and found that Machiavellians would score lower on taking the perspective of another person, which is one of those controversies actually we found in the literature based on paper and pencil tests. They are not as able to put themselves in the shoes of other people, and they don't feel emotional distress or concern, particularly for another person. So we found that in the preclinious region and nearby. Then the question is raised, why are Machiavellians so successful in many situations? So what we hypothesized is that they actually, in terms of empathy in a bottom-up fashion, they actually attune, so to speak, resonate with another person automatically at a higher level than the non-Machiavellian does. So they're, in a sense, worse on the thinking side, plan side, which they're known, though, for their cunning and things like that. But they actually, compared to an average person, they scored lower on those things. But they scored higher on this automaticity-like reactions of empathy. Of course, they're feeling it automatically in terms of the where we're measuring it in the brain, but they're not compassionate towards the person. So that's what we found. And these correlations are just showing what I just put into words. So, for example, the higher the score on Machiavellianism, the lower the score in the right temporal parietal junction. Okay. where some mirror neurons are believed to occur as well. Okay. We use the same experimental design, and these are the findings that I just put into words. I want to end. We also looked at managerial control, and because the first 2 studies were done with the brain in this paper, but then studies 3, 4, and 5 were done with a number of sales forces. And we looked at the correlation of Machiavellianism with many things: social intelligence, general intelligence, perspective taking, alliance building, many, many things. But one of the things that we looked at in interaction senses where there was high or low managerial control. Our hypothesis was that under conditions of high managerial control, the Machiavellian doesn't have much freedom to do their nefarious or deceptive tactics. And then also we looked at, in terms of performance, we looked at that. We also looked at organization citizenship behaviors and the relationship of that and managerial control, and found that managerial control moderates that. When there's a lot of control, you really put the constraints and restrictions on a Machiavellian. I was going to end with these questions here. In the next couple slides, I'm going to end with this. Do you know, have you ever had a colleague, boss, or employee who lies about his or her credentials and expertise, values people only by what they can do for him or her, successfully shifts blame for mistakes onto others, is so insensitive, cold, and unfeeling that it's scary, gets the promotions and recognition others deserve, emerges unscathed from attempts to stop his or her quest for power, money, and promotion? You might be dealing with a psychopath. Now, these aren't my words. I got this off the back cover of this book called Snakes in Suits. When psychopaths go to work by this consultant, Babiak and Robert D. Hare. Robert D. Hare is a professor now emeritus at the University of British Columbia who's developed the world's most famous measure for psychopathy, which is more of a clinical measure, and you're judging another person as an expert. So in the last few weeks, I developed a scale for psychopathy, 20-some item scale, and now we're applying it, and we're going to use the fMRI on high and low psychopaths to see if there's anything to be learned there. We've been really doing these high-risk, expensive things, not knowing all that's going to be happening. But here's something Hare said that got me off on this. And or Madoff, or who knows. The last thing we're doing is, well, I got my DNA analysis back. Guess what? I'm a Habsburg. And we've started taking swabs of managers of their saliva. And because we're going to be following, we're going in this genetic DNA direction now. The old theories would say that our behavior is in row A there is due entirely to our genes. But we're following the framework that says it's really a combination or interaction between our genes and the networks that are connected there and the environment that we're in, the relationships with parents and siblings, the larger environment, the economic constraints, for example, our facilitators, our education, and then that those, we're hoping to find what parts of the regions of the brain might be connected with that. Yeah. Okay, that's all I was going to do. Any reactions or questions? Anything on your mind? Yeah. Yeah, this is one where maybe we could turn off the camera, if you don't mind. Thanks. It's a long, long story. When I was a doctoral student in an early